The morning Dorothy Hale packed her belongings, the frost had already crept inside the window glass, tracing white fingers across the panes, as though the house itself was trying to hold something in. She worked by candlelight before dawn, moving without sound through rooms she had known for 35 years. Her hands finding each object in the dark, the way hands do when they have touched something 1,000 times. She was 62 years old. Her hair had gone the color of winter wheat, pulled back the same way she had worn it since she was a young woman in Pennsylvania, before George brought her west to Montana with 2 horses and a wagon full of surveying equipment, and a leather journal he treated more carefully than he treated most people. She was not a small woman, not fragile, not the kind of person strangers assumed needed assistance when they saw her age. She moved through the dark farmhouse with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades working alongside a man who believed that every unnecessary motion was a form of waste. The quilt came first, not because it was the most practical thing to bring, though it was warm and good wool, and the nights ahead would be cold in ways that her body at 62 understood differently than her body at 30 had understood. She took it first because it had belonged to George's mother, a woman Dorothy had known for only 4 years before she died, a woman who had pressed Dorothy's hands between her own at the wedding and said something quiet and certain that Dorothy had never forgotten. The quilt smelled like the cedar chest it had lived in. It smelled underneath that like something older, like the particular combination of wood smoke and pine resin and cold air that had meant home in this house for 3.5 decades. She folded it twice, pressed it flat against her palm, and laid it at the bottom of the canvas bag. She did not cry. She had decided not to cry 3 weeks ago, standing at the graveside in the frozen mud of the small plot behind the apple trees George had planted as saplings 20 years back, carrying them all the way from a nursery in Billings, wrapped in wet burlap, because he had wanted that particular variety and no other. She had watched men lower George into ground so hard, the gravediggers had needed 2 days and iron picks to break through. She had made her decision the way George had taught her to make decisions about geological formations and load-bearing structures by looking at what was true, accepting it without negotiation, and then calculating what came next. What was true was that George Hale was gone. What was true was that Curtis Hale had already visited the lawyer before the funeral flowers had wilted. What was true was that this morning was coming no matter what Dorothy felt about it. So she might as well be packed and ready when it arrived. Curtis stood in the doorway of what had been her bedroom for 35 years, watching her with his arms crossed over his chest. He was a broad man, 46 years old, with a jaw that suggested he had spent his life expecting to get what he wanted, and had been correct often enough to believe this was simply how the world worked. He had come into their lives 12 years ago, George's son from a first marriage that had ended before Dorothy knew George existed, appearing at the farm with a handshake and a quality of assessment in his eyes that Dorothy had recognized immediately, and George had chosen to interpret charitably. George had always interpreted people charitably. It was one of the things she had loved most about him, and one of the things that had in the end cost them everything. Curtis was wearing George's coat. It was the beaver pelt coat that had hung on the hook beside the front door for as long as Dorothy had lived. In this house, the coat George had worn on cold weather surveys and winter supply runs, worn enough at the elbows to show the underlayer shaped by years of use into something that held the ghost of the man who had worn it. Curtis had taken it at some point in the 3 weeks since the funeral. He wore it now with the comfortable ease of a man who believed he had earned what he had taken. The coat was too narrow in the shoulders for him. He said the law was clear. He said it the way men said things they had already confirmed with lawyers with the flat certainty of a concluded argument. The will names me as primary heir. The farm, the livestock, the equipment, the accounts, everything. A man named Colton would drive her to town at first light. After that, she was not his responsibility. Dorothy kept folding. She pulled a wool shirt from the drawer, shook it once, folded it along the seams the way her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old, and placed it in the bag. She had spent 3 weeks composing responses to this moment. She had lain in the narrow guest bed she had moved herself to the night after the funeral, listening to Curtis move through the house with the comfortable proprietary ease of a man who believed he had already won, and she had composed entire speeches in the dark. About George, who had built this house board by board over 2 summers, who had dug the well himself over 2 summers more, who had kept every financial record in neat columns in the ledger she kept on the kitchen shelf, and whose entries told the story of 35 years of careful, honest work. About herself, who had kept this farm running through droughts and difficult winters, and one year when the cattle market collapsed, and they had eaten from the root cellar for 6 months and never missed a mortgage payment. About the fact that Curtis Hale had contributed nothing to this land except his name on 2 visits a year, and the occasional opinion about how things should be done differently. She said none of it. She had learned in 62 years of watching how the world actually worked that some arguments cannot be won with words, because the person on the other side of the argument has already decided the outcome and has come not to discuss, but to witness acceptance. Curtis had not come to her bedroom door to hear her. He had come to watch her acknowledge that he had won, so she gave him nothing. No tears, no pleading, no rage he could feel superior to. She folded her wool shirt and placed it in the bag and reached for the next thing. What she was actually doing, moving through the room with the appearance of methodical packing, was looking for the loose board in the floor beside the window. George had shown it to her 17 years ago, pressing his finger to his lips with a conspiratorial smile that had made him look for a moment like the young man she had fallen in love with, rather than the middle-aged surveyor he had become, lifting the board to reveal a shallow space beneath. Not deep enough for valuables, he had said, but deep enough for things worth keeping private. She had assumed he meant documents, survey certificates perhaps, or the deed copies he was always careful about. She had respected the privacy of the gesture and had never looked inside during his lifetime. She looked now. Curtis had already found it. The space was empty, except for a thin layer of dust and a dead beetle on its back, with its legs curled toward the ceiling. Whatever George had kept there was gone, searched, and cleared at some point in the 3 weeks since his death. Curtis had been thorough. She should have expected that, but he had not moved the bookcase. George had built it into the wall of the study, the room adjacent to the bedroom, in the 2nd year they were married, when he had run out of places to put the engineering journals he collected throughout his career. It was heavy, constructed from the same dense pine as the walls themselves, notched shelves sized precisely for the journals he had accumulated over decades. Curtis had taken the journals. She had noticed their absence 2 days ago. He had presumably believed they had monetary value, or had simply swept through the room with the same comprehensive efficiency he had applied to everything else. What he had not done was move the bookcase itself. A man who hired other people to lift heavy things does not think to look behind heavy things. Dorothy moved to the bookcase and pressed her fingers along the bottom edge until she felt the seam in the floorboard, a seam that was almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to press. She tilted the case forward just enough, slipped her hand into the narrow space beneath, and found what she was looking for. The journal was thinner than she remembered, smaller than the professional volumes. It was wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the damp out for however many years it had been hidden there, bound with a strip of leather cut from an old belt. She did not open it. She pressed it flat against her body beneath her wool shirt and let the bookcase settle back against the wall without a sound. Curtis was still talking from the doorway. She had stopped hearing him. She fastened the canvas bag and lifted it onto her shoulder. 53 cents in the bottom of her coat pocket. She had been saving carefully from the household egg money for months. Since George first became ill, since she had begun to understand at some level, below conscious thought, that the illness was not the kind that ended in recovery. 53 cents that Curtis now claimed belonged to the farm, and therefore to him. She had not told him about the coins. She had carried them in her pocket every day for a week ready. She walked past Curtis without looking at him. She heard him say something else behind her. Something about the generosity he had shown her, perhaps, or the reasonableness of his position, given the legal situation, or perhaps both. She did not stop to determine which. Gideon Calloway arrived at first light with his wagon and his silence. He was a neighbor who had known the Hale family since before Dorothy arrived in Montana. A quiet man who kept his opinions inside himself, the way certain rock formations keep their heat thoroughly, and for a very long time. He loaded her single bag without meeting her eyes. He helped her up onto the wagon seat with a hand that lingered half a second longer than necessary. A gesture that contained an entire apology he could not speak aloud, because speaking it would have cost him something he could not afford to lose. They drove the 8 miles to Copper Creek without exchanging a word. The landscape on either side of the road was the pale gray of early winter. The grasses had been flattened by the first serious cold. The creek that gave the town its name ran low and dark between banks just beginning to ice at the edges. Dorothy watched it all with the attention of someone memorizing things they are not certain they will see again. Noting the specific way the morning light fell across the limestone outcroppings on the eastern ridge. The way the pines on the high slopes had already taken on the dark, compressed look. They got in cold weather, drawing themselves inward. At the edge of town, just before he pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Harding's General Store, Gideon Calloway reached into his coat pocket and pressed something into her hand without looking at her. 25 cents. 2 dimes and a nickel warm from being carried close to his body. His jaw worked for a moment, and what came out was quiet enough that the horse's breath nearly covered it. He said he was ashamed of himself. He said he wanted her to know that. She looked at the coins in her palm. She looked at the side of his face, the set of his shoulders, the hands holding the reins with unnecessary tightness. She understood that he was telling the truth, and that the truth was the only thing he had to offer her. People with more than the truth would have offered it. She said she knew. She thanked him for the ride. He drove away without looking back. She understood that too. 78 cents now. She stood on the wooden sidewalk in front of Harding's and watched Copper Creek begin its morning. A man she recognized as the blacksmith's assistant crossed the street, carrying something wrapped in canvas. 2 women outside the dry goods store exchanged words she couldn't hear, both of them glancing in her direction with the particular quality of attention that small towns directed at people whose situations had recently changed. Copper Creek was a town of 400 people in the Elk River Valley of western Montana. A town built on cattle and the remnants of the silver mining that had played out a decade earlier. A town where everyone knew everyone and knew everyone's business, and where the machinery of community opinion ground slowly, but produced results that were difficult to contest. Dorothy had lived here for 35 years. She knew every family by name, knew the histories, knew who owed whom and who had never forgiven what slight from which decade. She had delivered food to sick neighbors and helped with harvests and sat with the dying. She stood on the sidewalk now and felt the distance between all of that and what she actually had, which was 78 cents and a canvas bag and a journal hidden against her body that she had not yet opened. The boarding house across the street wanted 75 cents a night. She knew this because she had been on the committee that organized the town's social calendar for 15 years and had helped arrange accommodation for visiting speakers and circuit judges. 75 cents a night. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. The church offered charity, but Reverend Marsh ran his charity through a system of obligation that left recipients worse off than they had arrived. She had watched this happen to 3 families over the years. The math always looked better at the front end than it did 12 months later. The temperature was dropping. The sky had gone the color of dirty iron pressing down on the town. From all directions, the kind of sky that meant the light snow from yesterday was only the beginning of a longer conversation. Dorothy stood with her canvas bag at her feet and ran through her options with the same systematic process George had taught her to apply to survey site assessments before committing to a location list. What you have lists what you need. Calculate the gap and look for any available resource you have not yet accounted for. She was still running this calculation when the voice came from behind her. "You are George Hale's wife." The woman sitting on the bench outside the general store was old 70 or more, wrapped in furs that had seen decades of hard use, her white hair pinned beneath a wool cap that had been repaired so many times. The repairs had their own repairs. She was watching Dorothy with eyes that did not match the rest of her age eyes, that were sharp and still and precise as the blade of a well-kept knife. There was a quality of absolute stillness in the way she sat. Not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of someone who had learned over many decades that unnecessary movement was a form of waste. Dorothy said she was his widow. Since last month. The old woman nodded slowly, as though confirming something she had suspected. She said her name was Harriet Pruitt. She said she had lived in these hills longer than most people in this town had been drawing breath. She said George had fixed something for her once 40 years ago, something that had needed fixing badly and that no one else would touch, and that he had done it without asking for a single thing in return. She looked at Dorothy's canvas bag at her coat, at the particular quality of stillness Dorothy had been maintaining since she climbed down from Calloway's wagon. That man Curtis Hale threw you out. It was not a question. Dorothy said the will was clear. The law agreed with him. Harriet's eyes did not change expression. She said law being right and law being just were 2 different animals. Then she stood with the carefully economical movement of someone who had learned over many decades that energy spent without purpose was energy that could not be spent when it mattered. She said she wanted to show Dorothy something. She began moving toward the western edge of town, toward the hills that rose dark and pine-thick against the iron sky. And she did not look back to see if Dorothy was following. If someone had told Dorothy that morning while she was lying in the narrow guest bed, reading George's last letter for the 3rd time, that she would end the day walking into the Montana wilderness behind a stranger, she would have assessed the proposition with the same calm she applied to everything. She would have noted the risks. There were real ones. She was 62 years old with 78 cents and no particular plan for the evening. But she also noted the alternative, which was a wooden sidewalk and a dropping temperature and the specific arithmetic of 78 cents against a world that had already decided what it thought of her situation. She followed because Harriet Pruitt had spoken George's name with a quality of respect Dorothy had heard before, only from people who had actually known him. The respect of someone who had received something real from him and had not forgotten. And because the old woman had not offered charity or pity or a speech about the Lord's provision, she had offered something without explaining what it was. People who had something real to offer rarely needed to describe it first. The trail into the hills was invisible until you were already on it. Harriet moved through the pines and aspens with the ease of someone navigating their own house, never pausing to check her direction, never hesitating at a fork in the path. Dorothy kept pace, adjusting the canvas bag across her shoulder, watching the terrain the way George had taught her to watch it, not just the surface, but what the surface suggested about what lay beneath. The slope was limestone country. She could see it in the outcroppings, in the way the drainage had cut certain patterns through the hillside, in the particular blue-gray color of the rock, where it showed through the thin soil and the dead grass. George had spent 15 years explaining limestone to her. He had been the kind of man who found geology genuinely exciting, and had never quite understood that not everyone shared this excitement, but who had been so patient and thorough in his explanations that Dorothy had absorbed a working understanding of subsurface formations almost without noticing it happening. Limestone meant caves. Limestone meant water moving through rock in ways that were not visible from the surface. Limestone meant specific kinds of geothermal activity. Harriet spoke without turning, her breath coming out in small clouds in the cold air. She said George had been an engineer, survey work mostly. She said he had understood the earth. Dorothy said he had taught her what he could. She said he had written things down. Harriet was quiet for a moment, navigating a section of trail that had iced overnight, her steps placed with deliberate precision. She said he had surveyed these hills about 15 years back, working a contract for one of the mining companies out of Helena. She said he had found things the company did not care about, things that did not fit their particular purpose. Dorothy asked what kind of things. Harriet looked at her over her shoulder. The kind that keep a person alive in winter without burning a cord of wood. They walked for nearly 2 hours. The last of the daylight had gone thin and gray by the time Harriet stopped at what appeared to be a natural fall of rock on the hillside, a tumble of limestone slabs half hidden behind a growth of dead brush arranged with a randomness that Dorothy's eye, trained by decades of watching. George assessed site conditions, recognized immediately as deliberate. Someone had placed that brush. The randomness was too consistent to be accidental. Harriet pulled the brush aside without ceremony, revealing an opening in the hillside, approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, the edges worn smooth by water and time. Darkness beyond, and from the darkness, warmth. Not the sharp, dry warmth of a fire. Something softer, more pervasive. The warmth of air that had been held at a constant temperature for a very long time. Dorothy followed Harriet through the tunnel, which ran straight into the hill for perhaps 30 feet, before it opened without warning into a space that made Dorothy stop walking and stand completely still. The chamber was large, 40 feet across, at least the ceiling arching 20 feet overhead, in a curve that reminded her of the drawings of cathedrals she had seen in one of George's books. The floor was flat stone worn to something approaching smoothness by water that had moved through here over centuries, and then gradually retreated. And at the center of the chamber, a pool perhaps 8 feet across breathed a steady column of steam into the cool cave air. The water surface moved in small, slow patterns that had nothing to do with wind or current. They were the patterns of heat rising of water in constant, gentle motion from far below. Dorothy walked to the edge of the pool and held her open hand 12 inches above the surface. The heat rose against her palm in a wave that was steady and absolutely consistent. The temperature of a warm bath, unwavering. She understood immediately and completely what she was looking at. She said the word quietly, almost without intending to. Geothermal. Harriet looked at her with something that shifted slightly in her expression. Dorothy straightened and looked up at the cathedral ceiling, reading it the way George had taught her to read geological features as records of process rather than mere structure. She said the water came up from deep in the formation, picking up thermal energy from the rock below, carrying it to the surface. She said the limestone acted as an insulator, absorbing heat from the water and releasing it slowly into the air. She located the ventilation shaft by the movement of steam, a narrowing in the ceiling toward the back of the chamber. She said it kept the humidity from building past the point of comfort. Harriet watched her without expression for a long moment. Then quietly she said that George had taught her well. Dorothy said George had taught her to understand how things work. Harriet moved to a boulder near the pool and sat with the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints had opinions about cold and damp. She pulled her furs tighter. The warmth in the cave was working on her visibly, the set of her shoulders easing, her breathing slowing. She said she had been in a mine collapse 20 miles east of here, 15 years back. Roof came down, timber and rock buried her in the dark for 3 days before anyone found her. She said it in the even voice of someone who had processed this story thoroughly, over many years reduced it to its essential facts. She said George had been surveying the mine for the company that owned it, had no business anywhere near the collapsed section. She said he had heard her voice coming up through a crack in the formation, that sound traveled through limestone differently than through open air, that if you understood the acoustics, most people would not have known to listen for it. She said he had spent 18 hours getting her out, that he had understood the structure of the collapse, known which timbers he could move, and which ones were holding the weight of everything above, and that he had been right, and that nothing else had come down. When she asked him afterward what she owed him, he said the world only worked when people looked out for each other. He said that was payment enough. The cave was very quiet. Somewhere deep in the limestone water moved through channels carved over millions of years, picking up heat from the Earth's core and carrying it toward the surface in an endless, slow cycle that had nothing to do with seasons or money or the intentions of Curtis Hale. Dorothy said Harriet was paying a debt. Harriet said she was showing her a cave. She said she was 71 years old and not going to use the place much longer. She said someone should know about it, someone who would understand what it was. Then Dorothy remembered the journal. She had been carrying it against her body since she left the farmhouse that morning, pressing against her ribs through the wool shirt, a weight she had been aware of without allowing herself to think about directly. She reached into her coat now and removed it, unwrapped the oilcloth with hands that were steadier than she had expected, and opened it to the last page. George's handwriting on the final page was different from the rest. Not the careful, measured script of his professional entries. The precise notation of a man trained to record what he observed. This was something faster, pressed harder into the paper, the letters leaning forward as though the words were in a hurry. The handwriting of a man who understood he had limited time and needed to say something clearly. He had written her name at the top. He had written, "If you are reading this page, something has gone wrong and I am not there to help you. I'm sorry for that. I am sorry for whatever circumstances have brought you to this page. But I need you to listen to me now, the way you listened when we worked through problems together at the kitchen table. Without panic, without giving up before you have found the answer." He had written, "The earth does not stop giving heat because winter comes. The winter is only what happens on the surface. Below, the heat continues exactly as it always has, indifferent to the season. You are my wife. You understand how heat moves. Use that." Dorothy read it 3 times. Then she turned back through the journal, reading by the light that came down through the ventilation shaft, the steam-diffused glow of a cave that had been lit this way since long before any human being had thought to notice it. The professional entries came first. Field notes from surveys across 3 territories. Thermal measurements from specific sites. Observations about subsurface formations written in the precise shorthand of a working engineer. George had always kept two kinds of notes: the kind that went into official reports, and the kind that went into the journal observations too theoretical or too personal for a document submitted to a mining company. She knew this because he had read sections of it to her on winter evenings when the work was done and the fire was banked low. But she had not known about the entry dated September 1871, tucked between two sets of thermal measurements from a survey site in Wyoming. She found it near the middle of the journal, 2 pages in his careful hand, and she read it standing beside the pool, while Harriet sat on her boulder and watched and said nothing. George had written about a limestone chamber near a geothermal feature. Not this chamber specifically, he had not named it or given coordinates, but the description was precise enough to be unmistakable. He had written about the specific combination of conditions that created what he called a passive thermal system of exceptional efficiency: the constant heat source, the limestone insulation, the natural ventilation, the pool temperature. He had noted that such a space, properly understood and correctly utilized, could maintain habitable temperatures through any winter on territorial record without requiring any fuel input from the occupants. He had written in the margin of that page, in the smaller handwriting he used for personal asides, found it: September 14th. Will not report to company. Some things should stay outside the ledger. Dorothy looked up from the journal. She looked at the chamber, at the pool, steady and warm, the steam rising in the same patient column it had been rising in for longer than any human history in this territory, at the walls, pale limestone holding decades of accumulated warmth, at the ceiling its cathedral curve, at the ventilation shaft dark above. George had known. George had known this place existed, had surveyed it, had made the deliberate choice to keep it outside the official record. He had known she might someday need exactly this or something enough like it that his notes would be sufficient. And he had prepared for that possibility with the quiet thoroughness he applied to every engineering problem. Curtis had walked through the house with the confidence of a man taking inventory of what he had won, and he had taken the professional journals because they had visible value. And he had left the personal journal under the bookcase because he had not moved the bookcase. And he had left the mining company's survey record because he did not read geological notation. And he had left the information about this cave because it had been hidden in plain sight inside a language he had never bothered to learn. All his life, Curtis had looked at George Hale and seen a man who had accumulated a farm, some equipment, a modest savings account, and a wife who knew too much about rocks. He had seen inventory. He had never seen the other thing, the thing that could not be transferred through a forged will or taken by a man in a coat that did not fit his shoulders. Harriet said the temperature in the cave stayed at 57, 58 degrees year-round. She said the spring never changed. She said the water came up at 104 degrees and kept the air consistent regardless of what was happening outside. She said the coldest winter she had spent here years ago, the temperature outside had gone to 40 below and stayed for 3 weeks. And in the cave it had never dropped below 56 degrees. She stood from her boulder, then preparing to leave. She said she would come back in the morning. She would bring canvas rope tools for sealing the entrance. After that, Dorothy would be on her own. Dorothy looked at the chamber. She looked at the sleeping area Harriet had indicated, the flat rock near the wall where the stone radiated strongest, where a person could lay down bedding and draw warmth from below through the night. She looked at the storage alcove in the back where the air was driest. She looked at the ventilation shaft and calculated the draft pattern. She looked at the cool edge of the pool where Harriet had said the water was safe to drink. She thought about what George had written on the last page of the journal. The heat continues exactly as it always has, indifferent to the season. She asked Harriet why her. Of all the people she could have repaid the debt to, why, Dorothy Hale standing on a sidewalk with 78 cents. Harriet stopped without turning. She said she had heard what Curtis Hale told the people at the courthouse when he filed the will. She had heard it from someone who was present. She said Curtis had told them that George Hale had left nothing worth having. She turned her head just enough that Dorothy could see the sharp profile of her face in the dim light of the geothermal chamber. She said she wanted to prove him wrong. Then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the tunnel. The sound of brush being replaced across the entrance, and Dorothy was alone in a chamber that had been waiting patient as limestone for someone who needed it. She moved in that night. She worked in the dim light filtering down through the ventilation shaft, arranging her few possessions with the systematic logic that 35 years of working alongside an engineer had embedded in her thinking. Not where things felt right, but where the physics dictated they should go. The oilcloth journal went into the storage alcove where the air was driest. The food she had brought, precious little of it, went into the coolest section of the alcove where the temperature was stable enough to slow spoilage without freezing. Her bedding went down near the pool's edge on the flat rock that absorbed heat from the water moving below and released it through the night. She built a small fire at the cave entrance, where the smoke would travel up through the ventilation shaft and out into the cold Montana night without filling the chamber. She boiled water from the cool edge of the pool, which she had confirmed was safe, and she ate the last of the food she had brought from the farmhouse. Not much of it. A heel of bread, a few dried apple slices. She calculated what she had and what she needed, and how long 78 cents would last if she was careful. She sat for a long time with the journal open across her knees, reading by the soft luminescence of steam-diffused light. She read the professional entries about heat transfer and thermal gradients, and the specific behavior of water moving through limestone. She read the personal observations about specific springs he had surveyed, about the beauty of geothermal features, about what he called the elegant indifference of systems that had been operating since before the first human beings stood upright and felt the sun on their face. She read the entry about the cave. Then she read the last page again, his handwriting leaning forward, the letters in a hurry. The earth does not stop giving heat because winter comes. Outside, the first serious snow of the season had begun falling. The flakes were small and precise. The kind that settled without drifting and meant real cold was close behind. The kind that in Dorothy's 62 years of Montana winters, she had learned to read as a specific kind of message from the landscape. The sleeping area was exactly what George's thermal equations had predicted. The rock beneath her retained heat from the geothermal water moving below it, releasing that heat slowly through the hours of darkness, so that she lay on a surface that stayed consistently warmer than the air. The pool nearby kept the air humid and comfortable. She was warm in a way she had not expected to be warm, not the sharp warmth of a fire that required constant feeding, but the deep, even warmth of something that had been running without human intervention for geological ages and would continue doing so long after she was gone. She slept better than she had in 3 weeks. Outside, the snow continued falling over the Montana territory with the patient, comprehensive intention of something that had been doing this for a very long time and knew exactly how to finish what it started. Inside the cave, the temperature did not change. November came in hard and stayed. The cold that settled over the Elk River Valley in the first week of that month was not the tentative cold of autumn's end, the kind that apologized for itself in the afternoons and retreated overnight. This was something with weight and intention behind it, the kind that moved into the landscape the way a serious occupant moves into a house, rearranging everything, making clear from the first day that it planned to stay through to the end. Dorothy felt it each morning when she pulled the canvas seal aside to check the world outside the air, hitting her face like a flat palm. The temperature already well below freezing, before the sun had cleared the eastern ridgeline. Inside the cave, the thermometer Harriet had left on her second visit hung steady at 58 degrees. Outside, the world was becoming a different country. She built her days around the logic of conservation. George had applied a single question to every engineering problem he encountered. A question Dorothy had heard so many times over 35 years that it had become the structure of her own thinking without her ever consciously deciding to adopt it. What is the most efficient use of available resources to achieve the required outcome? She applied it now to everything. Every action evaluated before execution. Every calorie of food and every footstep in the snow and every hour of sleep calculated against what she had and what she needed, and how long the gap between the two could be managed. She did not wander. She did not experiment without reason. She moved through the hills around the cave in patterns calculated to gather maximum food with minimum exposure, minimum tracks, minimum evidence of her presence in any particular location. She set snare lines in 3 concentric rings at increasing distances from the cave entrance, rotating which ring she checked each day, so that no single approach path became worn enough to be visible from a distance. Harriet had shown her where to place the snares on the 3rd day of her teaching, moving through the terrain not with the deliberate instruction of a schoolteacher, but with the practical demonstration of someone who had done this many times in many circumstances. She had pointed out the specific features of the landscape that predicted rabbit movement, the particular shelter that certain rock formations provided the food sources that remained accessible in early winter, the micro-terrain that funneled small animals towards certain locations as reliably as water following a drainage channel. She had shown Dorothy how to read the snow for evidence of recent passage and how to distinguish between the tracks of an animal moving casually and one moving with purpose. Then Harriet had left and the work became Dorothy's alone. She was 62 years old. She was aware of this in ways she had not been aware of her age since the years when her children would have been born. If there had been children, the awareness of a body that had a specific history and specific limitations and could not be persuaded otherwise by determination or pride. Her knees had opinions about cold mornings. Her back communicated its preferences clearly after any extended period of kneeling in snow. Her hands, which had always been capable hands, took longer to warm after cold exposure than they had 10 years ago. None of this was catastrophic. All of it was information. She adjusted. She wore an extra layer at the knees. She did not kneel when she could crouch. Did not crouch when she could stand. Did not stand still when movement kept the circulation working. She timed her outdoor work for the warmest hours of the short winter days and returned to the cave before the temperature dropped in the late afternoon. She ate slowly and deliberately, recognizing that at her age in sustained cold, the body required more fuel than it announced wanting, and that the instinct to conserve food by eating less was a trap that would cost her more than it saved. George had written about this in the journal, not specifically about survival at 62, but about the thermal requirements of the human body in cold environments, the caloric demands of sustained exposure, the specific mechanisms by which cold killed people who did not understand what was happening to them. He had written it as engineering notation, precise and unsentimental, the same way he wrote about the heat capacity of limestone. Dorothy read those sections twice and took them as seriously as she took everything George had written, carefully enough to put down on paper. The rabbits came regularly in the first weeks of November. The cold had driven them down from the high country into the lower brush where food was marginally more available, and they were not yet wary of the snares in the way animals became wary after sustained trapping pressure. Dorothy learned their patterns through observation, the specific routes they traveled at specific hours, the way they moved differently on clear nights versus overcast ones, the way the terrain shaped their choices as predictably as physics shaped anything else. Her first catch she prepared at the cave entrance, working efficiently with the knife Harriet had left, and cooked the meat in the hot spring water at the pool's edge. The result was plain but genuinely nourishing. She ate slowly, noting the warmth spreading through her from the inside, and calculated how many rabbits per week she needed to maintain her weight and her capacity for the physical work that keeping herself alive required. The number was achievable. The mathematics were manageable for now. She went into town in the first week of December. The trip was a careful calculation. She needed flour salt and dried bean supplies she could not trap or forage from the winter hillside. She had 4 rabbit pelts prepared and dried, worth something at the general store if the price was reasonable. She took the long route down the mountain, varying the path she had used previously, adding distance to eliminate any pattern that might be tracked back to the cave entrance. Copper Creek looked the same as it always had in December. The wooden storefronts with their painted signs faded by another year of Montana weather. The street a mixture of packed snow and frozen mud. The smoke from a dozen chimneys rising straight up into air, cold enough to hold it vertical. Dorothy moved through the town with the efficiency of someone who had other things to accomplish, and no interest in extended conversation. She traded the pelts for flour salt and beans, at a price that was fair enough, conducted the transaction with the clerk who had known her for 20 years and was loading the flour into her bag when the sound of wagon wheels on the frozen street made several people in the store move toward the window. She did not move toward the window. She already knew from the quality of silence that fell over the room, and the particular way the clerk behind the counter straightened his spine, who had just arrived outside. Curtis Hale pulled his wagon to a stop in front of the hardware store across the street. He was wearing George's coat. She had known he would be wearing George's coat. He crossed the street and came into the general store, and the moment he saw Dorothy, his expression moved through surprise and settled into something that wanted to be contempt, but had something else underneath it. He said he had expected the cold would have settled things by now. Dorothy shouldered her bag. She looked at him directly, not challenging, not flinching, simply present in a way that gave him nothing useful. She told him she was managing. He asked where she was sleeping, naming the charity house and other places that communicated what he believed about her situation. She felt something settle in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the cave's geothermal system, a warmth that came from knowing something the man in front of her could not know. She told him she had the place, warm enough, warmer than his probably. His face tightened. He told her about his stoves, 2 of them, and about the wood he had burned through, and about his comfort. And the words had the quality of a man defending a position he had not expected to need to defend. He had come to confirm that the natural order had been restored. He had not expected this particular smile from a woman he had put out in October with nothing. He left the store without buying what he had come for. Dorothy watched through the window as he climbed back into his wagon and drove north toward the farm. She felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. She felt the precise, calibrated awareness of someone watching a system burn through its reserves at an unsustainable rate. The same awareness she had watching a campfire built too large for the wood available consuming itself in brightness before settling into darkness earlier than it should have. She took a longer route back to the hills. She'd been doing this since Harriet warned her about Silas Voss, the man Curtis had hired to find her. Never the same path twice in sequence, always adding lateral movement to break any trail she might be developing. always pausing at high points to observe the terrain behind her before descending toward the cave entrance. She was 62 years old, and she did not have the legs for unnecessary miles in deep snow. But the alternative to unnecessary miles was a found location and an ended winter. And that mathematics was simple. She saw nothing on the hillsides that should not have been there. She heard nothing that was not wind and the creak of pine trees contracting in the cold. She went back to the cave. She stored the flour and salt and beans in the alcove. She ate a small meal. She read the journal by the light that came down through the ventilation shaft, returning to the thermal entries she had already memorized, finding in the second and third readings the details that had not registered the first time through the marginal notes and the small corrections, and the places where George had gone back over an entry with a different ink and added something he had thought of later. December deepened. The wolves came in the last week of that month, precisely when the temperature dropped to 30 below and stayed there. She heard them for 2 nights before they found her snare lines a sound that traveled through the frozen air with extraordinary clarity. The howling of animals past the point of patience, hunting with the focused desperation of creatures that had run out of easier options. On the third morning, she walked her nearest snare ring and found it destroyed. Not sprung destroyed. The wire torn the stakes pulled the bait-consumed wolf tracks, pressed deep into the snow in a pattern that told a clear story. They had spent significant time here investigating thoroughly, understanding what they had found, and they would return. She reset the snares a quarter mile further from the cave. The next morning, the same result. She reset again another quarter mile. The morning after that, she stood at the edge of her farthest ring and counted wolf tracks, and understood that she was not dealing with animals moving randomly through her territory. She was dealing with animals that had identified her operation and were systematically dismantling it, following the logic of her movement through the landscape with the same patient intelligence she was bringing to the problem of staying alive. She recalculated. Without the snares producing reliably, her food supply had 19 days of margin. The cave kept her warm without any fuel cost, which was an enormous advantage that Curtis did not know he had failed to take from her. But warmth did not feed her. She needed protein, and she needed it consistently. And the wolves had claimed the territory in which she had been operating. She considered her options the way George had considered competing constraints in a survey problem, listing them without emotional weight, evaluating each against the available resources. She could fight the wolves directly, which was a losing proposition at 62, with a knife against a pack operating on the cold and hunger that made animals their most dangerous. She could relocate her snare operation entirely, which would cost time and energy she did not have in surplus. She could trap the wolves themselves, which required equipment she did not have, or she could make them leave. She found the relevant entry in George's journal on the 9th day of what she had started thinking of as the siege, the day her food supply dropped below the 14-day threshold, the day she allowed herself for the first time to calculate in specific terms what the alternative to solving this problem actually looked like. George had been surveying a mining claim in Wyoming when he observed a wolf pack's behavior near a geothermal feature. He had written 2 paragraphs about it in his careful notation. The sulfur content of certain hot spring outputs was sufficient to function as a territorial deterrent to large predators. Wolves avoided areas with strong sulfurous odors not from any learned experience, but from the same deep instinctual logic that made them avoid fire. The smell signaling conditions hostile to life in a way that bypassed reason and spoke directly to survival. The cave's pool had only a faint mineral odor, barely detectable after weeks of living beside it. Harriet's rough map showed other springs on the hillside, including 2 she had marked with small notations. Dorothy studied the map and identified the most likely candidate based on terrain and the geological principles George had laid out across 3 decades of patient explanation. A spring 2 miles north, where the formation suggested a more direct connection to deeper thermal sources. She went in the early morning of the 10th day, moving through a landscape that had been simplified by cold into pure geometry. White ground, dark tree trunks, pale sky. She was aware of every step, every breath, the weight of her 62-year-old body, moving through terrain that required negotiation at every yard. She did not rush. Rushing was how people made mistakes in conditions like these, and mistakes in conditions like these carried consequences that did not allow for correction. She found the spring where the map indicated, announced by a smell that reached her from 30 yards away like a physical presence. The water at the center was too hot to touch and too sulfurous to drink at any temperature. The stones around its edge were stained yellow and orange by mineral deposits laid down over centuries of contact. She gathered a dozen of those stones in her bag, handling them with strips of canvas to avoid transferring her own scent to the placement locations, working methodically, despite the cold in her fingers and the ache in her knees from kneeling on frozen ground. She carried them back to the cave. She placed them around the perimeter of her snare territory, in a wide arc positioned at the specific intervals George's entry had described, as sufficient for coverage handling each stone, only through the canvas wrapping. She rebuilt the destroyed snares. She returned to the cave. She waited 4 days. The wolves tested the perimeter twice. She could track their approaches and retreats in the snow, each time a careful investigation, followed by an abrupt withdrawal. On the 5th morning, their tracks stopped at the sulfur stone line and turned back. On the 6th morning, there were no new tracks at all. She ate well that night for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. She sat near the pool in the warmth that had not wavered through any of it, and she felt something that was not quite triumph, because triumph suggested she had been in a contest with the wolves, and she had not. She had been in a contest with her own understanding of a problem, and her understanding had been sufficient, and George had made it sufficient 17 years ago, when he wrote 2 careful paragraphs about wolf behavior near a Wyoming geothermal feature, and kept them in a journal under a bookcase. It was while she was eating, not looking at anything in particular, that she noticed the marks in the snow near the cave entrance. She had come in from the north from the direction of the sulfur spring, and she had entered the cave without completing her usual circuit of the south approach. She had been tired, and the problem had been solved, and she had allowed herself a moment of reduced vigilance. The kind of moment that felt earned and was, in fact, the most dangerous kind. The marks were boot prints, not her own, which were a different size and a different tread pattern. Someone had approached the cave entrance from the south and stood there for some time, long enough to leave a cluster of overlapping impressions in the snow before moving away toward the eastern ridge. The prints were several hours old at least. The person was gone, but they had found the entrance or had come close enough to it to matter. Dorothy did not sleep well that night. She was awake in the pre-dawn dark 5 days later when she heard movement outside the entrance. Not wind, not the settling of branches, the specific irregular rhythm of a human being navigating difficult terrain while managing equipment. A sound she had heard many times when George returned from field surveys in bad weather. She was on her feet before the brush screen was disturbed, the knife in her hand, her body against the cave wall in the shadow position she had been practicing since the boot prints appeared, positioned where anyone entering from outside would need 30 seconds for their eyes to adjust before they could reliably locate a still figure in dark clothing. He came through the tunnel and into the chamber, and he collapsed near the pool with the boneless completeness of a body that had spent its last available reserves reaching the warmth. and had nothing remaining for staying upright. He was young middle-20s by the look of him, with the particular weather-worn quality that fieldwork in hard country gave people who did it seriously. His equipment marked him before his words did. A leather transit case still strapped across his chest, the kind surveyors used for precision instruments, worn in the specific places that came from actual extended use rather than recent acquisition. Beside it, a map roll in a waterproof tube. He had not seen her. His eyes were closed against the warmth he was absorbing, his breathing shallow and rapid, in the way of bodies working hard to restore what the cold had taken. Dorothy watched him for a full minute before she spoke. In that minute, she assessed everything she could assess. His size relative to her own, the equipment he carried and what it indicated, the condition of his clothing which showed days of hard field use, the absence of any weapon drawn or visible despite the fact that he had just entered an unknown space in low light. A man expecting to find an enemy would have arrived with a hand on something. He had arrived with both hands on his own chest. She told him not to move. Stay where he was. Let the warmth work. His eyes opened. He located her with the careful eye movement of someone trying not to move his head, identifying the voice and the knife in the same moment. His expression moved through confusion toward a heightened attention. Not panic, but the rapid calculation of someone assessing an unfamiliar situation. He told her he was not armed. He said he was a surveyor. He said he had seen steam rising from the hillside and followed it, thinking it might be a cabin. She told him it was not a cabin. He said he could see that. He said his name was Emmett Whitfield. He said he worked for a geological survey company out of Helena, under contract to the Montana Mining Company. He had been caught in the open since the previous afternoon. He had lost his bearing in the flat light of an overcast day and spent the night in a snow shelter before following the steam source at first light. Dorothy looked at the transit case, at the map roll. She looked at his hands, which she could now see clearly enough to assess. The fingertips on both hands were showing the waxy white coloring of serious frostbite. He was not yet feeling them, which meant the damage was significant enough to have moved past the initial pain phase. She lowered the knife to her side, not putting it away. She told him he was going to stay where he was and let the warmth work on his core temperature before she dealt with his hands. She told him he had frostbite, and that if he tried to use his hands before she treated them, he would do damage that would not reverse. She told him he would stay in the cave until he could walk properly, and when he could walk, he would leave and tell no one about this location. He said he understood and agreed. He said the terms were fair, given that staying was the only outcome where he survived with all his fingers. She worked without hurrying, applying the treatment Harriet had shown her on the second day of her teaching, the one that had seemed unnecessary in October, and now seemed like the most useful thing anyone had ever taken the time to demonstrate. Gradual warming with water from the pool's cool edge, careful attention to circulation, nothing that introduced heat too quickly. She had seen frostbite on hands and feet and ears during Montana winters. She knew what it looked like at different stages, and she knew what each stage required. Emmett watched her work with attention that was focused and genuinely interested rather than performative, the attention of someone observing a process they wanted to understand. On the third day, when he was awake consistently, and the immediate danger to his hands had passed to the point where careful movement was possible, he told her about his training. 2 years of coursework at a geological institute in Denver, followed by field work across 3 territories, under a senior surveyor who had insisted on a specific curriculum. He described the required reading with the specificity of someone who had found it genuinely formative rather than merely assigned. He said the most significant work he had studied was the thermal survey methodology developed by a surveyor named George Hale, covering the Yellowstone Basin, and several adjacent territories in the early 1870s. He said the technique for mapping subsurface thermal features through surface indicator analysis, reading plant growth patterns and mineral staining and water behavior at surface level, to determine what was happening hundreds of feet underground was still considered the most reliable approach available. He said his senior surveyor had told the class that every geothermal survey conducted in the United States built on Hale's foundational methodology, whether the surveyor knew it or not. Dorothy sat very still. She said George Hale had been her husband. The change in Emmett's face was not the polite adjustment of someone revising a social calculation. It was the genuine recalibration of someone encountering something they did not expect, in a context where they had thought they understood what they were looking at. He sat up from where he had been reclining slowly, his body still careful about sudden movements. He looked at her with the particular quality of attention that came from finding another person substantively, genuinely interesting. He said he had been living inside George Hale's life's work for the past 2 months without knowing it. Dorothy said she had been living inside it for 35 years. On the 6th day, when Emmett was mobile enough to sit upright and manage a cup of hot spring water without assistance, he spread his survey maps across the flat rock Dorothy used as a work surface. He had been building to something since the previous evening. She had noticed the quality of his attention when she had described George's unpublished observations about the Southeast Formation. The hesitation that suggested a man working out how to say something he understood would matter. He showed her the section of his map covering the area Curtis had commissioned the survey for, and he showed her where the survey boundaries sat in relation to the cave location. And he explained what the surface indicators in the Southeast Formation suggested about the subsurface thermal source. Then he showed her the contract documentation he carried in the waterproof tube. Curtis Hale had commissioned the survey 6 months before George died. Not after the inheritance, before. The contract bore Curtis's signature on a date that placed it squarely in the period when George was ill, but still alive, still the legal owner of the land, still the person whose permission would have been required for any survey conducted with the intention of commercial development. Dorothy looked at the date on the contract for a long time. Curtis had not decided to want the land after George died. He had decided to want it while George was dying, had arranged for a professional assessment of its commercial value before the man was in the ground, had forged the will to obtain it, not out of grief or opportunism in the immediate aftermath of loss, but out of calculation that had been running for months. George had spent 35 years building something on that land. He had spent the last months of his life watching a man he had tried to treat, charitably calculating what pieces of it to sell and to whom. The cave was very quiet. Emmett was watching her face carefully. She asked him what the formation was worth. The geothermal source, the one Curtis had commissioned the survey to assess. Emmett said he had not completed the survey. The temperature drop had cut his fieldwork short before he reached the southeast site. But based on the surface indicators he had documented in the 2 weeks before the weather turned, he said the source was substantial, possibly the most significant undeveloped geothermal feature in the territory. Commercially, he said that kind of resource represented a significant extraction opportunity for a company with the capital to develop it. Dorothy thought about George's marginal note in the 1871 journal entry. Found it. September 14th. Will not report to company. Some things should stay outside the ledger. George had known what the formation was worth. He had known for 15 years. He had kept it outside every official record because he understood that the moment it appeared in a ledger, it would attract the kind of attention that ended with the landscape being consumed by something that could not be replaced. He had spent 15 years protecting it with nothing more than omission and a journal kept under a bookcase. Curtis had found the edges of what George had hidden. Not the cave, not the exact location, but the shape of the thing, the rough outline of a geological feature that had commercial value, enough to commission a survey, enough to arrange a forged will, enough to put a 62-year-old woman out in October with 78 cents. Harriet came 3 days after that conversation, arriving before dawn, with the timing Dorothy had come to associate with the old woman's particular form of caution. She took in Emmett's presence and his position in the cave and the map between them, and she assessed all of it in approximately the time it took to sit down on her usual boulder without comment. She had brought dried meat, a piece of cured pork wrapped in cloth and news. She had written a letter in December, she said, to a contact she trusted in Billings, asking a specific question about a specific lawyer named Harlow Keene, who had practiced law in that city for more than 30 years, and who had drawn up a particular document in the spring of 1886. She had received the reply the previous week. Harlow Keene was 68 years old. He was still practicing. He was still sharp. He had, according to her contact, kept meticulous records of every legal document. He had ever prepared, a professional habit that had served him well in disputes before, and that he showed no signs of abandoning. He would, Harriet believed, be willing to testify to the contents of any will he had prepared, if the request came through proper legal channels. Dorothy was very still. She asked what will Harriet was referring to. Harriet looked at her with those sharp eyes and said she had been a witness at a document signing in the spring of 1886 in Harlow Keene's office in Billings, at the request of George Hale, who had asked her to be present and to sign as a witness to his wife's legal testament, the document that recorded his actual intentions for the disposition of his property and his provision for Dorothy after his death. She said the document Curtis had filed with the county court after George died did not match the document she had witnessed. She had read both. She could account for every material difference. Dorothy asked her how long she had known this. Harriet said since the week after the funeral, when she had seen the filed copy and recognized that it was not what she had signed her name to. She said she had been sitting with the knowledge and the weight of what it meant to act on it, what it would cost, to stand as a witness against a man with Curtis Hale's resources and his cultivated network of obligations across the community. She was 71 years old, she said. She was running out of winters to do the right thing. She reached into her coat and produced a letter sealed with red wax pressed with her thumbnail, and she placed it on the flat rock between them. Her written statement. Everything she had witnessed in her own hand, signed with her full name. Dorothy picked up the letter. She held it for a moment without opening it, feeling the weight of what it represented, what it had cost Harriet to write it, and what it would cost her to stand behind it in a proceeding. Emmett said that as a registered professional witness under territorial statute, his certification of the document would give it additional legal standing. He looked at Dorothy. He said his certification was not a favor. He said it was the correct professional and ethical response to having witnessed what he had witnessed in this cave, and that he intended to provide it, regardless of what she decided to do next. Dorothy said she understood. 3 days after that, Silas Voss came. She was awake when he arrived, as she had been awake at the same hour for the past 2 weeks, her body having decided on its own that the early morning dark was a time requiring alertness rather than sleep. She heard the brush screen being moved from outside, not the wind's random pressure, but the deliberate, careful displacement of something being examined by hands that knew what they were looking at. She was against the cave wall before the sound completed itself, the knife in her grip, her position in the deepest shadow. Emmett was awake, too, across the chamber, an iron pipe in his hands that he had positioned near his sleeping area. after Harriet's warning about Voss. Silas Voss came through the tunnel alone and emerged into the chamber, and stood at its edge without moving for 30 full seconds, working the space with the patient, systematic attention of someone trained to read environments before committing to any action. He was a lean man in his late 40s, weather-worn in the comprehensive way of people who had spent decades working in outdoor conditions, his clothing functional and unremarkable. His face had the quality of stillness that belonged to people who had spent years concealing what they were thinking. He was not what Dorothy had imagined when Harriet first said his name. She had imagined someone whose danger announced itself in his size or his manner. Voss's danger was quieter than the danger of a man who had found people who did not want to be found many times before, and had developed a methodology for it. He located Dorothy before he located Emmett, which told her his threat assessment was well calibrated. He looked at the knife. He looked at her face. He did not move toward his coat. He said that Mr. Curtis Hale wanted to speak with her. Emmett stepped out of the shadow near the storage alcove, the pipe visible, and opened his leather certification case and held it at a distance sufficient for Voss to read without approaching. He identified himself and his professional standing and stated that everything occurring in that space was on record from that moment forward. Voss read the card. He was quiet for a period in which Dorothy could see him doing exactly the kind of calculation she did with food supplies and thermal gradients, assessing available resources against required outcomes, and finding the most efficient path through the competing constraints. A 62-year-old woman with a knife was one category of problem. A credentialed professional witness with institutional backing and the ability to carry what he witnessed directly into a territorial court proceeding was a different category entirely. Dorothy told him to tell Curtis Hale that she knew where she was living and had no interest in a conversation. She told him that she had been in contact with an attorney in Billings regarding the terms of her husband's actual will, and that this information would affect whatever calculations Mr. Hatch was currently making. Something moved in Voss's expression. The slight recalibration of a man who had been briefed on a situation and was learning the briefing had been incomplete. He said he would communicate what she had said. His voice had shifted half a register, the professional courtesy, now containing a different quality. The quality of a man managing his own exposure to a situation that had become more complicated than he had been paid to manage. He moved back toward the tunnel without turning his back. A professional habit, and he replaced the brush screen carefully from outside, leaving no unnecessary trace of his presence. Dorothy did not move until his footsteps on the frozen ground had faded entirely beyond the range of hearing. Then she looked at Emmett, who lowered the pipe and let out a long breath through his teeth. He said Voss would tell Curtis. She said yes, and Curtis would come. She was already calculating. Voss had arrived from the south, which confirmed the approach route she had been watching. Curtis would use the same path when he came. The timing depended on how quickly Voss could reach him, and how quickly a man who had spent the winter burning through his resources in a leaking farmhouse could make the journey up a mountain in serious cold. 2 days, she said, maybe 3 if the temperature held. Outside, the wind had picked up along the ridge, moving through the pines with the sound of something that had decided this particular stretch of Montana winter was not finished yet. The cold pressed against the canvas entrance seal, with the patient, comprehensive pressure of a force that understood it had time on its side. Inside the cave, the pool continued its steady breathing steam, rising in the same column it had maintained through every hour of every day since the first frost, as indifferent to the complications of the human world as it had always been, as it would be, long after those complications had resolved themselves one way or another. Dorothy sat down beside it and opened the journal to the first page and began reading from the beginning. the way she had done on the first night in the cave. Reading it now as someone who had spent 4 months learning what it felt like to apply her husband's knowledge to the problem of staying alive in a world that had decided she was finished. The words looked different now than they had in October. They looked like exactly what they were. A man who had understood something important, who had written it down carefully, and who had trusted the person he loved most to find it and use it when she needed it. She was not finished. She had never been finished. The earth beneath her continued giving its heat exactly as it always had, indifferent to the season, indifferent to the opinion of anyone who stood in a dead man's coat and believed that knowing the law was the same thing as knowing the truth. The bitterest cold of the entire winter descended without warning on the first day of March. Dorothy felt it before she saw its evidence, a change in the quality of the air itself, when she pulled the canvas seal aside in the early morning. Something that was not merely cold, but cold of a different order. Cold that had mass and intention behind it. The way a landslide had mass and intention. The kind that the oldest people in Copper Creek had been known to describe with a particular flatness in their voices, as if ordinary language was insufficient for what they had survived. The temperature outside dropped to 50 below before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline. The wind reached velocities that made the pine trees on the slope sound like a crowd of people all trying to speak at once. The snow it carried was not falling snow, but horizontal snow moving parallel to the ground, filling every hollow and crevice and sheltered space with the indifferent thoroughness of water finding its level. Inside the cave, the thermometer read 57 degrees. Dorothy and Emmett sealed the entrance with every layer available to them, canvas and hide, and the additional piece of blanket Harriet had brought on her last visit, wedged and pressed into every gap until the tunnel was as closed as human hands could make it. They could hear the world trying to come apart outside and feel none of it except as sound. A sustained roar that pressed against the limestone from all directions and found no purchase. The pool breathed its steady column of steam. The walls held their warmth. The ventilation shaft, protected by its upward angle and the limestone formation around it, continued its patient exchange of air without admitting the violence of the weather outside. They had enough food for 9 days if they were careful. Dorothy had made sure of that. She had been calculating toward exactly this kind of event since November, building margin into her stores during the weeks when the trapping was good, treating every additional rabbit and every successful foraging run as an investment in a reserve she hoped never to need, but understood she could not afford not to have. She was 62 years old, and she had lived in Montana long enough to know that this territory held its worst intentions in reserve until March, when people who had survived the main body of winter relaxed into the assumption that the danger had passed. On the first day of the storm, they stayed inside entirely. On the second day, Emmett checked the entrance seal and reported that the snow had built a drift against the brush screen that was itself a form of insulation, an unintended gift from the weather. Dorothy spent both days reading and organizing and doing the small maintenance tasks that a cave required, checking the alcove supplies for any moisture that had found an unexpected path through the rock, ensuring the bedding was positioned correctly relative to the thermal gradient from the pool, keeping the entrance seal in repair against the pressure the wind applied to it in sustained gusts. She did not think excessively about Harriet. This was a discipline rather than an absence of concern. She had learned over 62 years of living in circumstances that required clear thinking, that worry was a form of expenditure, that the energy spent rehearsing bad outcomes was energy that could not be spent on managing actual ones. Harriet had told her before the storm that she was planning to come in the first week of March. Harriet had not come on the first day or the second day. This was information. It was not yet a conclusion. On the morning of the third day, the wind had dropped to a level that made the outside world navigable. Not comfortable, not safe by any ordinary measure, but passable for a person who understood what they were moving through, and moved through it with appropriate respect. The snow that had fallen in the past 60 hours lay in drifts that transformed the familiar landscape into something that had to be read differently. The usual reference points buried or altered beyond immediate recognition. Dorothy put on every layer she had and told Emmett she was going to check the northern approach. He said he would come with her. She did not argue. They went out together into a morning that was pale and still with the particular stillness that follows extreme weather. The silence of a landscape that has been scoured and rearranged and is now settling into its new configuration. Their breath came out in heavy clouds. The cold was no longer violent. It was simply comprehensive, present in every direction at once, as fundamental to the air as the air itself. Dorothy found Harriet at the base of the north-facing slope in a shallow depression, where a drift had built up around her in the hours since she had stopped moving. The old woman was lying on her side, her face turned toward the cave entrance she had never reached. Her furs pulled close around her in a way that suggested she had understood what was happening and had made herself as small and protected as possible in her last hours. Her white hair had come loose from its wool cap and lay against the snow like frost patterns on glass. She was carrying a pack on her back. The pack contained dried meat wrapped in cloth, a folded blanket, a tin of crackers, and a sealed envelope pressed with a bead of red wax that bore the impression of Harriet's thumbnail. Her only available seal, the same seal she had used on the witness statement she had left weeks before. Dorothy knelt in the snow beside her and stayed there for a time she did not measure. The cold pressed against her from every direction. She did not feel it in the way that she had understood cold for the past 4 months, as an adversary to be managed and accounted for. She felt it as a presence, simply the same presence that had been there since October. Indifferent, as always, asking nothing and acknowledging nothing. Harriet Pruitt had survived 40 years of Montana winters in these hills by understanding what the earth offered and accepting it on those terms. She had saved Dorothy's life by showing her a cave. She had documented what she witnessed at a will signing and placed that documentation in Dorothy's hands at cost to herself. She had been coming back to the cave in a March blizzard carrying dried meat and a tin of crackers because she had said she would come in the first week of March, and she was the kind of person who did what she said she would do. Dorothy looked at the face of the woman who had shown her what she needed when nothing else had been available to show her, and she stayed on her knees until Emmett touched her shoulder. And she stood. They built the cairn together from stones on the hillside, working without speaking, selecting pieces of the pale limestone that characterized this particular slope, the same rock that formed the cave walls and held the warmth, and had been doing exactly what it was designed to do by geology rather than by human intention. For longer than any story anyone had ever told about this territory, they worked until the cairn was solid and permanent and would survive what remained of winter and the spring thaw and the seasons beyond. When it was done, Dorothy stood and looked at what they had built and spoke into the wind that had come back light and cold from the north. She said, "The earth keeps you warm now." She opened the letter inside, standing by the pool, the steam rising slow between her and the limestone walls. Harriet's handwriting was careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the conscious intention of legibility, the penmanship of someone who understood this was a document that might matter in ways her previous letters had not. The letter confirmed the will, George Hale's actual intentions for his property and for the provision of his wife Dorothy, recorded in Harlow Keene's office in Billings in the spring of 1886, witnessed by Harriet Pruitt, and one other person whose name and current address Harriet included. The contents were exactly what Dorothy had always known them to be. The farm, the livestock, the equipment, the accounts, all of it left to Dorothy unconditionally, with specific language about her right to remain on the land for the remainder of her life, without condition or contest. The document Curtis had filed with the county court after George's death did not match this. Harriet listed the specific differences with the precision of someone who had read both documents carefully and compared them line by line. She had read the filed copy on the day it was entered into the county record, standing at the clerk's counter while he processed the paperwork, and she had recognized immediately and with certainty that it was not what she had signed her name to in Billings. At the end of the letter below Harriet's full signature, and the date was Harlow Keene's professional address in Billings, and a single final line. "The earth keeps you warm, Dorothy. Everything else you have to earn." Dorothy folded the letter and placed it inside the oilcloth that held George's journal, so that the two documents rested against each other in the same wrapping. George's knowledge and Harriet's testimony, the two foundations on which everything that came next would have to be built. Emmett sat across the pool and watched her face while she read. When she looked up at him, she saw that he had already understood the general shape of what the letter contained, because he had understood the general shape of the situation from the first night he had spent recovering in the cave, listening to a geothermal system. His training had taught him to recognize, maintain its perfect indifference to everything the weather was doing outside. He said the railroad would open again in 2 weeks, 3 at the outside. Dorothy said Silas Voss would reach Curtis within 2 days of the storm ending. Curtis would come before the railroad opened. Emmett looked at her steadily. He said they could leave now, take the letter, get to town, and speak to the sheriff before Curtis could reach them. He said the letter and his certification and Harlow Keene's records were sufficient to initiate a legal inquiry. Dorothy sat with this the way she sat with complex calculations, turning it over and examining each element without rushing to a conclusion. An inquiry was not a resolution. Curtis had money, and the network of small obligations he had spent years building through strategic generosity. The kind of credit that could be called in to delay proceedings, to challenge evidence, to extend a legal dispute past the point where an older woman with limited resources could sustain engagement. The farm would sell in the chaos of a prolonged challenge. She would win the argument eventually and lose the outcome in the meantime. What she needed was something cleaner. What she needed was Curtis himself. She said they would wait. She said he was coming to find something, and she was going to let him find it. Emmett looked at her with the particular quality of attention he had directed at her work and her thinking for the past weeks. The attention of someone who had stopped being surprised by the calibration of her assessments and was now simply watching to see what form the next one would take. He did not argue. He trusted the calculation. She arranged nothing artificially in the days that followed. She simply made sure the cave was precisely what it had been since November, the organized sleeping area positioned for optimal thermal absorption. The storage alcove with its carefully managed provisions. The cooking apparatus at the entrance. The pool steady and steaming. George's journal open to one of his thermal diagrams on the flat rock she used as a work surface. The cave made its own argument. She only needed to let Curtis enter it. He came on the 3rd day after the storm in the early afternoon. She knew he was alone before he appeared. She had been watching the southern approach from the ventilation shaft, the narrow, vertical slice of hillside, visible from a particular angle when the light was right. One figure moving slowly through the lower pines, with the labored gait of someone whose body had been losing a sustained argument with cold for months. Silas Voss was not with him. Whatever Voss's calculation about his continued involvement in a situation, that had become more legally complicated than he had been paid to navigate the result was that Curtis had made this climb alone. She heard him breathing before she saw him, the effortful breathing of a man whose reserves had been depleted by a winter he had not adequately prepared for, by a farmhouse that leaked heat through every shifted frame and gap in the floorboards, by 60 cords of wood that had burned faster than any budget he had constructed. He came into the chamber and stopped. He was wearing George's coat still, but it hung on him now in a way it had not in October, loose across shoulders that had lost the weight and solidity of a man living comfortably. The coat that had rested on a well-fed body, now resting on something reduced the way a house looks after its furnishings have been removed, and only the structure remains. He had lost 30 pounds at least. The assessment was visible in the coat in his face, in the way he was standing carrying himself with the careful attention of someone who had learned over the course of one very long winter that his body was less reliable than he had believed it to be. His eyes moved through the cave with the specific efficiency of a man doing a rapid and involuntary assessment. They moved across the organized sleeping area, across the storage alcove with its careful provisions, across the cooking setup, across the pool, the steam rising patient and steady, across George's journal open on the flat rock, across Dorothy standing near the pool, not challenging, not performing, simply present. Something moved across his face that she recognized only because she had spent 62 years watching human beings encounter things they had been avoiding understanding. It was the expression of a calculation that had been wrong from the beginning, finally resolving into its correct answer. The specific discomfort of a mind encountering the truth it has spent months managing its distance from. He said, "So this is how you did it." His voice was rough from cold, not quite steady in the way of a man who had been alone with his own thoughts for a long time and had not liked what he found there. "Dorothy said this is how I did it." Curtis looked at the pool for a long time, at the steam, at the walls, at the ceiling with its cathedral curve, at his own hands, which were red and rough and cracked in the specific way of hands that had spent months managing firewood in temperatures that 2 stoves could not adequately counter. He said he had burned through 60 cords. He said the savings were nearly gone. He said the cattle had died in January. All of them 38 head frozen in the pasture before he could get them into the barn in time. He said the farm would sell for a fraction of its October value if he could find a buyer at all. He said this the way a man recites the terms of a loss he has already absorbed, not asking for sympathy, simply accounting for what had occurred. Dorothy said she knew. She had been tracking the shape of Curtis's winter through every available source, Harriet's reports before her death, Emmett's information gathered in town, the occasional piece of news she had collected during her own careful supply runs. She had watched Curtis's version of winter unfold from the warmth of the earth, while his version of warmth consumed itself cord by cord. His eyes moved to Emmett, acknowledged the pipe, moved back to Dorothy. She said, "Silas Voss told you I had been in contact with a lawyer in Billings." Curtis said, "Harlow Keene." She said, "He drew up George's real will. He has records. He has memory." She paused, giving the information space to settle into whatever space was available in the mind of a man standing in a warm cave after the worst winter of his life. "And I have a written account from Harriet Pruitt, who witnessed the signing attesting to the will's contents and to the fact that the document you filed with the county court after George's death was not the document she witnessed." The sound of Curtis's breathing changed slightly. A man who has been holding a specific tension for months, releasing it 1 degree at a time. He said, "Harriet Pruitt is dead." Emmett's voice came from the alcove, measured, carrying the specific weight of professional authority. He said that a written statement produced before a witness's death and certified by a credentialed third party was admissible in territorial proceedings. He said he had certified the document. He said Dorothy held the original. Curtis sat down on a boulder near the pool's edge, not because he was invited to, but because his legs had reached the limit of what they were prepared to do without rest. He sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the water moving in the pool. The heat rising from it, the mineral smooth stone around its edge. He was quiet for long enough that the cave's ambient sounds became present again. The water, the faint movement in the ventilation shaft, the very slight sound of steam meeting cooler air. Dorothy waited. She had learned this from George, who had written in the journal about geological processes, about the impulse to accelerate a natural conclusion, being almost always counterproductive about the energy spent forcing a result, being energy that could not be spent on what came after. Some things needed to complete themselves at their own rate. Curtis looked at the pool for a long time. Then he looked at his hands again. Then he looked at the coat he was wearing and seemed for the first time to see it clearly. The coat that had hung on the hook beside the farmhouse door. For the entirety of the time Dorothy had lived there, the coat shaped by years of belonging to a specific man, in a way that could not be altered by transferring it to a different pair of shoulders. He reached into the inner pocket of the coat. He reached into the pocket that lay closest to the body of the man who had worn it. First, the inner left pocket, where George had always kept the things he considered too important to risk. In an outer pocket, the folded survey permits and the property deed copies. And once in the 3rd year of their marriage, a small pressed flower. He had brought back from a Wyoming survey and never explained. He produced a folded piece of paper, its creases worn soft from many foldings and unfoldings, the edges beginning to separate at the corners from the handling of months. He held it in his hands for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "I kept it, the original." He said he did not know exactly why he had kept it when he had the filed copy in place and the legal machinery already running in his favor. He said he had told himself it was insurance, something to hold in reserve. But that was not the honest answer. And he had spent enough of this winter with nothing to do but think to have arrived at the honest answer. He said maybe I kept it because throwing it away felt too much like admitting what I had done. And I had not admitted it to myself yet. He held the document out across the space between them. Dorothy crossed the cave floor and took it from his hand. She did not rush. She walked the way she walked through everything now with the economy of movement that 4 months of careful living had made her natural posture, the movement of someone who had learned that efficiency and dignity were not in competition with each other. She unfolded the paper carefully, smoothing the worn creases and read. George's handwriting at the top, the careful, precise script of a man who had spent his career writing things that needed to be read correctly by other people. The date in the upper right corner, spring of 1886. The language of legal intention, formal and unambiguous. The language Harlow Keene had spent 4 decades learning to make precise. The farm, the livestock, the equipment, the accounts, all of it to Dorothy Hale unconditionally. Language about her right to the land for the remainder of her life. Language about her authority to make decisions regarding the property without condition or contest. The specific phrasing of a man who had understood that language mattered, who had sat in a lawyer's office in Billings and chosen every word with the deliberateness he brought to geological survey reports. At the bottom, George's signature. Below that, Harriet Pruitt's witness signature. The same careful hand that had written the letter, Dorothy carried in the oilcloth bundle. Below that, a second witness signature. Dorothy did not recognize the contact Harriet had mentioned. Dorothy read it once. Then she read it again. Then she folded it carefully along its existing creases and held it. George had tried to protect her. He had sat in Harlow Keene's office while he was ill and put his intentions into language that could not be misread. And the protection had been taken from the hook it hung on and replaced with something that wore its shape without containing its substance. And now it was back in her hands where it had always belonged. Emmett stood in the alcove doorway, silent present. Witness. Dorothy looked at Curtis. He was still sitting on the boulder. He looked like a man who had put down something very heavy after carrying it for a very long time, not relieved exactly because putting down a heavy thing that you should not have been carrying in the first place was not the same as relief. It was the specific exhaustion that came after. She said, "You go to Sheriff Brackett. You tell him exactly what you did. The will, the forgery, all of it." Curtis met her eyes with the direct quality of a man who had moved past the management of appearances and was now simply reporting conditions. He said he would. He said not because he had become a good person. He said he was aware that he had not become a good person. But because she had enough to put him in a courtroom regardless, and because she had pulled him out of the snow on the North Slope 3 days ago, when she could have left him there, and because those two facts together constituted a kind of argument he had not had a response to. Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the North Slope. She thought about the moment she had heard his voice outside the entrance, weakened and uncertain, in a way she had never heard it before, and the decision she had made in the space of a single breath. She had not made it because she was a forgiving person by temperament, or because she had decided to be generous. She had made it because George had spent 18 hours digging Harriet Pruitt out of a collapsed mine shaft, because the world only worked when people looked out for each other, and because that belief had set in motion the chain of events that had kept Dorothy alive through the worst winter in territorial history, and because walking away from a man dying in the snow was not something she was willing to do, regardless of who the man was. She thought about what leaving him there would have made her. She thought about the specific calculation involved, what it would have saved her, and what it would have cost her. And she knew the arithmetic the same way she knew the thermal gradient of the cave. Not because she had been told, but because she had thought it through herself and understood it completely. She said, after that, "We are finished with each other." Curtis stood from the boulder with the deliberate effort of someone whose body had become an instrument that required careful management, rather than one that could be trusted to respond without attention. He straightened inside George's coat. He buttoned it. He walked to the tunnel entrance and turned. He said the journal. George's personal journal, the one with the leather cover. He said he had taken it with the professional volumes in October. He said he had not read it. He said he had thrown it in the fire with some papers he was clearing because he had not known what it was. Dorothy looked at the oilcloth bundle in the storage alcove at the shape of the journal inside it. The journal she had rescued from behind the bookcase before she left the farmhouse. The journal Curtis had not found because he had not moved the bookcase. She said nothing. Curtis looked at her for a moment. Then he went into the tunnel. His footsteps on the frozen hillside lasted longer than Silas Voss's had, slower and more careful. The sound of a man descending with the attention of someone who understood that a fall now would cost him something he could not replace. The forest absorbed them gradually, and then there was only the cave. Emmett came to stand beside her at the pool. Neither of them spoke for a while. The steam rose between the silence and the limestone ceiling patient, as it had always been, as it would be, after everything else in this story had resolved itself into memory, and after the memory had resolved itself into something quieter still. Dorothy said he thought there had been another journal, a more valuable one, Something with maps or survey coordinates or the location of something that could be converted into money. Emmett said there had been. He just could not read it. She looked at him. He said the journal he threw in the fire contained information about how to live well in the world, how to read what the earth was offering and accept it on those terms, how to treat the knowledge you were given as something to be passed forward rather than hoarded. He said that was worth more than any survey coordinates. He said Curtis had held it in his hands and seen nothing worth keeping. Dorothy looked at the cave, at everything she had built inside it over 4 months, at the sleeping area and the storage alcove and the cooking setup and the carefully maintained entrance seal, at the pool unchanged from the first night she had stood beside it and understood what she was looking at George's journal on the flat rock open to a thermal diagram her husband had drawn by lamplight in a Wyoming field 30 years ago. She said, then I suppose he paid a fair price for what he understood. Emmett almost smiled. The spring moved through the territorial legal system with the slow thoroughness that proceedings required, each step documented and verified, and entered into the record with the care appropriate to matters that would determine what came after. Emmett made the journey to Billings when the railroad opened in the 3rd week of March, carrying certified copies of Harriet's letter, Dorothy's formal deposition, and a letter of introduction from Sheriff Brackett to Harlow Keene's office. The journey took 3 days. Harlow Keene was 68 years old and had been practicing law in Billings since before Montana was a territory in any official sense, and he kept his records in a system of his own devising that allowed him to locate any document he had prepared in under 10 minutes. He had been waiting in the quiet way of conscientious professionals for someone to ask him the right questions about the right document. He had known when he filed his copy after George Hale's death that the document entered into the county record by the estate claimant did not match what he had prepared, and he had documented this discrepancy in his own records and waited. The conversation with Emmett took 40 minutes. Curtis Hale had gone to Sheriff Brackett's office the morning after he descended from the mountain, arriving before the sheriff had finished his first cup of coffee, and he had sat in the chair across from the desk and told the whole thing with the flat efficiency of a man who had decided on a course of action and was executing it before the part of him that wanted self-preservation could mount an effective counter-argument. Brackett had listened with the expression of someone whose categories for understanding a situation were being reorganized while he watched a man who had known Curtis Hale for years and was receiving information that did not fit the version of events he had been operating with. He was not a bad man. He had simply not been given accurate information before. Curtis was taken into custody that same afternoon. Not dramatically. There was no scene, no public moment of consequence. He walked with Brackett into the back of the office and the door closed. Dorothy was not present. She had heard about it the following day from the woman who ran the dry goods store, who had heard it from the deputy's wife who had been there when it happened. The county judge made his circuit through Copper Creek 6 weeks later. Harlow Keene's testimony occupied the proceedings for one morning. His records were complete. His memory was precise, and the truth in this case required very few words from a man who had spent 4 decades learning to use words with accuracy. The discrepancies he documented between what he had prepared and what had been filed were not matters of interpretation. They were matters of fact. The verdict was what the evidence required. The farm and all its associated property had belonged to Dorothy Hale since the moment of George's death. Curtis's filing had been fraudulent. His subsequent actions were added to the accounting. 3 years in the territorial prison outside Helena. He left Copper Creek on a morning in April, when the snow had finally begun to retreat from the lower elevations, and the creek was running high and cold with snowmelt that carried the smell of the high country down into the valley. Dorothy was not present at his departure. She had nothing left to witness there. She bought the parcel of hillside that included the cave and the spring and the slope above it, where Harriet's cairn stood visible now as the snow retreated the pale limestone she and Emmett had stacked in the blizzard aftermath, catching the April light with a specific quality of permanence. She bought it through the county land office on a morning that smelled like thaw and new growth, with Emmett beside her, and his signature next to hers on the purchase document. Paid with money that had made its long journey back to the purpose George had always intended for it. The farm sold in May. The ranching company that bought it came with their own assessment of the land's value and paid a price that was fair without being generous. Dorothy accepted it without negotiation, because what she needed from the money was not comfort but foundation. And the foundation she had in mind was already built. She spent 3 days in late May carving the headstone from a piece of the pale limestone that came from the hillside using tools borrowed from the hardware store, and returned with careful thanks. The letters were not perfectly uniform, but they were deeply cut and would last longer than anyone currently living would be around to read them. Harriet Pruitt, 1815 to 1887. She taught others to listen to the earth. The burial was a small gathering, the few people who had known Harriet well enough to make the climb to the hillside on a May afternoon. Sheriff Brackett came. 2 women from the town who had known Harriet in her younger years came, women who remembered her from before she had decided the hills suited her better than the company. Emmett was there. Dorothy stood at the grave after the others had moved away in the new warmth of a May afternoon, with the hillside releasing the smell of thawed earth and new grass and pine resin. And she said what she needed to say into the space between the headstone and the sky. She said she had not known Harriet long enough, but Harriet had known exactly how long was necessary, had known what she was doing when she sat on that bench and waited for Dorothy to come out of the store, had understood that the debt she was carrying was of the specific kind that required not money or labor, but exactly the right knowledge passed to exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. She said, "George would have been glad to know what you did for me. He always believed the world worked when people looked out for each other. You proved him right one more time." The cabin took the whole summer to build. Emmett designed the pipe system, applying his professional training in geothermal features to residential heating for the first time in his experience, and Dorothy contributed the refinements that George's journal suggested. In its marginal sketches, the speculative drawings of a man who had imagined applications that did not yet exist. They laid pipes in the floor that would carry hot spring water beneath the living space, radiating upward through the board floors in the slow, even warmth that required no stove, no fuel, no daily tending. The earth would do the work. The earth had always been doing the work. They were learning to receive it. The cabin was small but built well from timber cut from the hillside, according to a plan that left the existing tree cover intact, positioned on the slope above the cave entrance, close enough that Dorothy could walk to the pool in 2 minutes, far enough that the cave retained its character as a separate space. The place Harriet had given her, the place she had survived, the place where she had read George's last words and understood what he had left her. She kept the cave. She kept it the way Harriet had kept it, as something not to be advertised, not to be explained to visitors who had not earned the explanation, not to be made into a curiosity for people who would see only the surface of it. She went there sometimes in winter when she wanted to think without distraction, when the particular quality of that warmth and that silence was what she needed. She kept Harriet's rough map on the cave wall, weighted with one of the sulfur stones from the perimeter she had set against the wolves, a reminder of the specific sequence of knowledge applied to the specific sequence of problems that a winter could produce in a person who was paying attention. On the south-facing slope below the cabin in the first autumn after the cabin was completed, Dorothy planted apple trees. She ordered the specific variety from a nursery in Billings, carried them home on the wagon wrapped in wet burlap, the way George had carried the originals from Pennsylvania 30 years before. She planted them in the late September ground with the deliberateness of someone making a statement about time, about the relationship between what you invested and what you expected to receive, about the particular kind of faith that consisted not of certainty about outcomes, but of commitment to the process regardless. George had always said that planting trees was the most optimistic act available to a human being. He had said you planted them for the people who came after you, and that this was not a sacrifice, but a privilege. She planted 17 trees that autumn. Years settled into each other, the way seasons did in Montana, with full commitment to whatever each one required. The cabin's floor was warm in January, and the pool never changed its temperature, and the apple trees grew in their own time on the south slope. Dorothy learned the territory around the cave with the deepening familiarity of someone who had decided to understand a place rather than merely inhabit it. She read the hills the way George had read geological formations, as records of process, as evidence of what had happened over time and what was likely to happen next. The spring of 1904 came in gently, the way the best Montana springs came, without the apology of a late winter or the aggression of sudden warmth, but with a gradual increasing quality of light that arrived a few minutes earlier each morning and lingered a few minutes longer each evening, until one day you realized that the slope above the cabin was green and had been green for some time, without your marking the exact moment it changed. Dorothy was 80 years old that spring. She had been 80 years old for 3 weeks when she sat on the porch of the cabin in the morning warmth of a late April day and felt the heat rising through the boards under her feet. The geothermal warmth that had been flowing through the pipe system since Emmett installed it 17 years before, unchanged in its temperature and its consistency, as everything else about the years had changed around it. Her granddaughter Nora was 15 and sitting on the porch step below her, in the particular posture of a young person who had not yet learned to pretend that paying attention required effort. Leaning slightly forward, her eyes moving from the steam thread barely visible above the cave entrance to the apple trees on the south slope to her grandmother's face and back again. Dorothy watched her watching. She recognized the quality of attention. She had seen it in George on the evenings he came home from a survey with something he wanted to think through. She had seen it in Harriet on the day they met on the bench in front of Harding's General Store. She had seen it in herself in the mirror on the mornings when the problem she had gone to sleep with had arranged itself into clarity overnight. It was the attention of someone who understood that the world contained more information than was immediately visible and was committed to finding it. Nora said, "Tell me about the cave. The whole thing from the beginning." Dorothy looked at the hillside above, at the thread of steam barely visible against the blue of the morning sky, thin and white and patient, rising from the same source it had been rising from since before any human being had thought to notice it. At Harriet's headstone on the north slope, visible from here on clear days, the pale limestone catching the morning light with the same quality it had always had, the particular color of rock that had spent its geological life holding warmth and giving it slowly back. She felt the boards warm under her feet. She said the winter of 1886 was the worst in territorial history. The snow started in November and did not stop until March. The temperatures dropped to 40 below. People burned their furniture to stay warm. She paused. She felt the warmth rising through the floorboards from the pipes below from the spring that had not changed its temperature by a measurable degree through any winter. She had lived beside it, through any season or legal proceeding or loss or beginning. She said, "I did not burn anything. The earth kept me warm." Nora looked up at her with the interest of someone who already knew this was more than a story about weather. Dorothy reached into her coat. The same reach George had made when he wanted to share something that mattered, the reach she had made on the night she packed her canvas bag and found the journal in the dark behind the bookcase. She produced the oilcloth bundle, worn now to the soft flexibility of cloth that has been handled with care over many years, and she unwrapped it with the care of someone handling something that had been important for a long time and would remain important long after this moment. The journal was darker with age than it had been in 1886. The leather worn at the corners, the binding showing the evidence of many readings in many conditions. The oilcloth had done its work. The pages inside were still clear, still legible, the thermal diagrams still precise. The handwriting of a man who had understood how things worked and had taken the time to write it down carefully enough that the understanding could survive him. She held it out to Nora. Nora took it with the instinctive care of someone receiving something whose importance she recognized before she fully understood why, turning it over in her hands, feeling the weight and the history of it. Dorothy said your grandfather wrote that. Everything he understood about the way heat moves through the earth, the way the earth stores energy and releases it, the way water carries warmth from the deep places to the surface and gives it to whatever is there to receive it. She watched Nora's hands on the journal cover. She said, I read it the winter I was 62 years old, in a cave by the light of a hot spring. I read it until I could use it, and using it kept me alive. Every problem I faced that winter he had written something about. Not always about the exact problem, but about the principle behind it. The thermal behavior that explained the wolves, the geological logic that explained the cave, the human reasoning that explained what to do when someone takes everything you have and you are standing on a sidewalk with 78 cents and the temperature is dropping. Nora said, what if I do not understand all of it? Dorothy smiled. It was the same smile she had given Curtis Hale in Harding's General Store on a December morning when he needed her to be suffering. And she was not the smile of someone who knows something the world has not managed to take from them. She said, then you will learn. The journal is not a test. It is an invitation. She looked at the hillside, at the steam, at the apple trees on the south slope. 17 of them now in their 17th year, producing in full the harvest that George's original trees had never reached before they were sold with the farm. She said, knowledge does not diminish when you pass it on. George knew that. Harriet Pruitt knew that. It is the one thing that works against entropy, the one thing that accumulates rather than depletes when you give it away. Nora opened the journal to its first page. Dorothy watched her begin to read, watched the particular quality of attention that reading something genuinely new for the first time produced in a young face, the slight forward lean, the stillness, the eyes moving across the page with the specific, purposeful speed that meant comprehension was happening rather than mere recognition. The spring kept flowing. It had been flowing through the founding of the territory and through the worst winter in recorded history, and through a courtroom proceeding and through the raising of apple trees and the carving of a headstone and the building of a cabin, and all the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of a life built on a foundation that the earth provided free of charge to anyone who understood enough to build there. It would be flowing after Nora and after Nora's children, and the children after them carrying heat from the deep places to the surface with the patient indifference of a process that required no human participation to continue and only benefited from human intelligence, when that intelligence arrived humble enough to work with what was already there rather than against it. Dorothy sat on her warm porch in the spring light and listened to the hillside and felt what she had felt on the first night in the cave. The first night she had laid down on the warm stone with George's words in her mind, and understood that she was in exactly the right relationship with what surrounded her. Warm in the way that the earth warms things, from below and from inside, and without end.